Johnny, He Rode the Ghost Train by Phoebe and Todhunter Ballard. Mirage, of course, as defined by the dictionary, is an optical phenomenon produced by a stratum of hot air and the varying density across which the observer sees reflections of some distant object. In southern Arizona, between the Little Dragoon Mountains on the north, a brown, bare spire of rock lying like a skeleton of a dinosaur, and its rugged peaks of the Dragoons proper on the south, where Cochise made his stronghold, there stretches a dry lake, barren of growth, flat, white, forbidding, and dead. Nothing lives there, nothing moves there, yet periodically a train, smoke boiling from its bell stack, was seen across the bleak expanse. Those who had seen it claimed they could hear the busy chuff of the engine and the clatter of wheel flanges on iron rails. The train appeared to be crossing a glittering blue lake, as if the glowing sand recalled an ancient memory of a time when the vast emptiness was a living seabed. But the nearest right-of-way ran on the far side of the distant mountains. No one in his right mind ever thought to ride this ghost train. Certainly not Johnny Cowden. Johnny was a young man with a single purpose: prospecting. He had a quick wit, a solid intelligence, and a ready grin. Together they made him a favorite of scattered ranch houses and isolated mines of the boom towns of the Southwest. But for all his gregariousness, Johnny was a loner in his trade. Despite his youth, he had already covered most of Arizona and New Mexico's mining districts. He was driven by restlessness, and the fact that he had not yet made a strike to net him more than $100. He was a true prospector. He had utter faith that just over the rocky ridge lay his El Dorado. So, when in the late 1870s he heard the whisper on the wind of a new silver excitement in the Dos Cabezas Mountains, he left Tombstone and headed northeast. He was in a hurry. All prospectors are when they hear the siren call of a fresh strike, certain that unless they reach the ground at once, all the valuable claims will have been staked. Johnny took his bearings with his mind's eye on the shortest route and outfitted himself to meet his demands. It was midsummer. The temperature hovered around 110 up, and he figured he had about 70 miles to cross between water holes. He was strong and filled with confidence. He had a burro, lightly loaded, with a minimum of his possessions. Besides his canteen, he had a water bag of his own invention. It was made of heavy canvas sides that allowed just enough evaporation to cool the water slightly. He had devised it under studying a Mexican pottery oas hanging in the shade of the roof sidewalks throughout the border towns. He calculated, starting fresh, he could cut across the Dragoons in one day, camp and rest on the shore of the dry lake, and when night came, push on directly across it. The lake was a waterless stretch, too hot to cover in the daytime. He would have detoured around it and headed north to pick up the Wilcox stage route, but he would save a whole day by going straight across the level bed, and it was easier walking as long as he didn't get lost. Out in the middle, there was no horizon except for the stretch in white sand, but at night he could steer his course by the stars. Johnny made good time, occasionally glancing at Lion Peak off his left shoulder and trying to ignore the sun, his wide hat pulled down against the burning rays. He reached the last slope of the foothills above the lake and camped in the shade of a rock burst. If he slept until sundown, he would be able to cross the lake bed and reach the stage road on the north side, sometimes in the next afternoon. Then he would rest again, and the last leg of the new camp would be a cinch. He watered the burro, had his sparing drink, and shared his cold biscuits with the little animal. He did not picket it. Hundreds of miles to travel with him, but Jenny had never strayed more than a few yards from camp. He did pull off the paddle sack with his provisions and the precious bag of water, so the burro could rest too. He beat the brush for snakes and dug his hip holes and wiggling into a comfortable position, and he went to sleep. He wakened by a scream. He lay for an instant, orienting himself to the sound, and grabbing his rifle from the ground at his side, came to his feet. He recognized the scream of a hunting cat, and he knew it was a burro that the beast would be after. In the dark, and he overslept. This was the second reaction, that he would have been on his way long before now. His first concern was the Jenny. He could not see much, and he went forward cautiously, listening for further sounds. What he heard warned him that the cat had already made its kill, and his hands tightened on the gun. But he never got to shoot. By the time he found the slaughtered burrow, the cat had torn what it wanted from the small body and vanished into the rocky hills. Johnny stood beside the mangled carcass, and a hard lump rose in his throat. He and the burrow had covered many strikes together, many lonely miles, and the little beast had never failed him. But sentiment was not enough to turn him aside, and to make him follow the killer's trail to take revenge. He had that other call he must answer. He turned back to camp, his eyes accustomed to the dark now, and stopped, staring in consternation. In its blind flight from the attacking cat, the burrow had blundered through the mound of supplies beside the empty pack saddle, scattering them beyond recovery. But it wasn't the burst flour sack or the end of bacon ground into the gritty soil that made Johnny groan. It was the water sack, laying flat and empty against the rocks, ripped open by the burrow's sharp hoof. Johnny had never needed profanity and wasted no time in cursing now. He picked up a side of bacon and half a dozen dried biscuits and wiped them on his sleeve. Then he tested his canteen. It was better than half full. Holding it, he looked across the dry lake, weighing his chances. The moon was up, and a silver sheet covered the enormous flatness, so wide that Johnny fancied he could see the curvature of the earth. The sensible thing would be to head back south and re-outfit and try again. But prospectors are gamblers. The lake lay cool and inviting, and without the lagging burrow, he should be able to walk 6 or 7 miles in an hour. Johnny hesitated only a moment, and then he took a small drink from the canteen by way of a toast to his fortune, and started out. The walk through the night was easy, and the moon gave him his direction, and the sand was hard packed under his boot. When the daylight came, the world was still as flat as the ocean around him. He could not see the low ridge of rocks that would tell him he was nearing the far shore. He could only go forward and hope to make it across before the sun would strike it down. It looked like a ball of fire rising out of the haze in the eastern sky, and as it rose, heat increased until the air waves rising from the sand tasted like the breath of a blast furnace. When it was overhead, John knew that all his years on the frontier he had never known such heat. His senses grew sluggish, and the hot haze that rose around him was like a curtain, hard to see through. He felt his body's tissues crawl as the moisture was sucked from him. His tongue was growing too large for his mouth. If only there was shade, just a little shade to relieve for a few moments of the monotonous heat of the sun. But there was none. The floor of the lake remained bare, and though it had been scraped by a blade. He stopped, anchoring his feet against their tendency to stumble, and sipped from his canteen. He had taken many sips in the last 5 hours, and the bottle was distressingly light. The sip only aggravated his thirst. He felt that he could drink sea water, and his body was drying up like jerked meat. He lurched on, and about 4 o'clock he swallowed the last of the water, almost boiling now, and heaved the useless canteen away. Peculiarly, the unburdening of the light vessel seemed to give him added strength. He straightened, and for a quarter of a mile he pushed forward at increased speed. If only he could last until sunset. Suddenly, he became aware of a set of tracks. He stared at them, and he mulled his mind trying to focus on the unbelievable possibility there was another human being out in this vast emptiness, another man who might have water. Then, very slowly, his brain cleared the suspicion. He lifted his foot and placed it in the boot print ahead of him. The tracks were his own. He had been traveling in a circle, and he did not know for how long. In his daze, he must have forgot to check the position of the blazing globe above. Johnny sat down and cried from exhaustion and frustration, although there was no moisture left in him for tears. He continued to sit, not because he had given up, but because he had no idea where he was, which way to start again. Why walk when each step would probably take him deeper again into the waste? Better to wait in darkness where he could endure that long. Then the moon would at least give him points on the compass. So he sat in the merciless glare, trying to hold to the wavering senses. Then he saw a mirage. At first, it was only water, perhaps a wishful hallucination, blue water and waves flooding across the dead lake. Johnny struggled up, reaching forward instinctively, then dropped his hand, for he still had enough wits to recognize it for what it was. The image grew sharper, terrifyingly real. Johnny squeezed his eyes closed, and when he opened again, he saw the train. It was coming towards him at an angle. Every detail of the big chuffing engine and the two yellow-painted cars behind were sharply distinct as a lithograph. Smoke rolled from that fat stack and blew back across the water. Johnny had heard stories about the train ever since he had come into the country, but he had never seen it before. It moved steadily, deliberately through the waves without disturbing them, and he could see no rails. He watched it, fear sharpening his fading senses, making him forget the thirst. Then a rage broke in him. It was bad enough he was doomed to die here, but why must this vision appear to mock him? This was a real train, and if the water were real, he would be saved. He heard a whistle, the clang of a bell, and the whine of wheels on an uneven track. Hysteria washed away his rage. Johnny began to laugh, to jump up and down, and to wave his arms. Then he heard himself screaming, and he knew his mind was broken, and screamed at the top of his lungs, yet no sound came from his parched throat. The only sound was the steady throbbing of the coming train. He watched fascinated horror as it headed directly for the spot where he stood, looming larger and larger, the brass rim of the headlight glinting. The two big drivers, locked in their bars, spun monstrously. The sooted face of the engineer craned from the cab. Johnny's every fiber cried to him to run, to dive for safety before the heavy flanges crushed out with the life remaining in him. And where he had stopped and stepped for a moment, now paralyzed and unable to move. At last the moment of the vision was refracted away. It would not grind him over, but it would pass within 4 or 5 feet. It did not pass. The roaring engine came abreast of Johnny. The brake shoes screamed as they bit against the wheel rims. The couplings crashed together, and the train stopped. Like some puffing monster that stood, steam hissing from the engine and from the connectors between the cars. Johnny could almost have reached out and touched it, but he did not dare. Then the door at the end of the second car opened, and a blue-coated conductor swung down the high steps and stood beside him, calling out, "What? All aboard?" Johnny heard it clearly, but he could not move, and the voice rose in impatience. "Come on, we're already behind." The conductor pulled a turnip watch and read it. 15 minutes late now, and we weren't supposed to make the stop." He looked towards the engine and raised his hand in a highball sign. The whistle shrilled, and the driver began to turn, protesting. The conductor stalked forward, caught Johnny's arm, and wrenched him from the place where he was rooted, boosting him up the steps of the car platform, and the car jerked into motion. Johnny stumbled against a heavy door, without strength to open it. The conductor reached across him and swung it inward, and, supporting Johnny, shoved him through. The car was well full. There was a white blur of curious faces, acrid smells of coal smoke and tobacco. Then Johnny's vision reeled as the conductor steered him and pushed him down into a seat. Johnny did not think that he lost consciousness. He heard a murmur of sympathetic voices above him through the blacked-out haze, and he heard one man say, "Poor guy, he's had a real tough time. He's about done in." "Water," was the unintelligible word that came from Johnny's throat. "Water. Water." "Hey, he's coming around." There was astonishment in the tone. "Get a cup of water. Don't give him too much." Johnny opened his eyes, expecting to see the conductor and the passengers in the car. Instead, he saw strangers, a window with words painted on it. Johnny closed his eyes and opened them again, not knowing what to believe. What was real? What was fantasy? But the water felt real as it crossed his cracked lips and swollen tongue. His body accepted it was real. Then he gave him only a little at first, although he begged for more. Then gave it to him in drops, allowing time for it to seep through his tissues. And finally, when he could frame the words, he asked where he was. They told him he was in the sheriff's office in Wilcox, and that the man named Markham had found him stumbling across in circles about 5 miles outside of town. They knew who he was. They asked where he had come from, and he told them about the burrow and crossing the lake, and about the train. They stood nodding, understanding. Thirst and the desert heat make for strange imaginings. He asked what day it was, and they told him. Johnny set his chin stubbornly. Markham had found him just after sundown, the day he had spent in the lake bed. It was impossible for him to walk to Wilcox between 4 and sundown, in the best of his condition. There were too many miles between. He said so, and repeated the story of the train picking him up. They told him he had his dates mixed. Johnny insisted. He knew that he had left Tombstone, and knew when he had entered the dry lake, and they told him the sun had done its work on him, and had addled his brain. But Johnny Cowden knew what he knew, and no argument would ever convince him he was wrong. He had seen the train, he had heard it, he had ridden it. He stuck to his story. Before he left the Wilcox Sheriff's Office, he had earned the name Crazy Johnny, and that followed him forever.